Hi, and welcome back to lecture number 46. This is the last lecture in period 5, comparison in period 5. So we're going to go through and review everything. The learning objective is compare the relative significance of the effects of the Civil War on American values. And the first key concept is the United States became more connected with the world, pursued an expansionist foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere, and emerged as the destination for many migrants from other countries. So let's talk about the comparison between how the United States dealt with other countries. So with Britain, it was more diplomatic over the Oregon Territory. And with Mexico, we went to war over the boundary of Texas and Mexico, and we ended up getting the Mexican Cession out of that war. The military strength of each of the other two countries played a big part in the decision to deal with one diplomatically and with the other with war. At the same time, Irish and German immigrants are coming to the United States through different push factors in Europe. And there is a difference in how the two immigrant groups settle. The Irish are settling in the cities, meanwhile the Germans are settling in rural areas. Both experienced discrimination and the nativist movement. The next key concept is popular enthusiasm for U.S. expansion, bolstered by economic and security interests, resulted in the acquisition of new territories, substantial westward and new overseas initiatives. So this is manifest destiny in the United States. Migration west was being fueled by different opportunities. Gold in California, timber in the Pacific Northwest, farming in the Plains regions, all had to contend with natives in California. A lot of natives were killed after the acquisition of the territory through the Mexican Cession. In the Plains region, as people were crossing, they would encounter natives, and often it would end in a violent encounter. And railroads are going to affect the movement of all. So as more railroad track is being laid down, the more and more migration that is able to happen. All right, in the 1840s and 1850s, Americans continued to debate questions about rights and citizenship for various groups of U.S. inhabitants. So beginning with the debates over immigrants, political parties varied on their approach. The Know Nothing Party wanted to stop immigration altogether. In regards to citizenship rights for African Americans, the Free Soil Party wanted to stop the spread of slavery. You see the two banners for each one there. Both had previous former presidents as the candidates in their presidential campaigns. So Millard Fillmore for the Know Nothings and Martin Van Buren for the Free Soil. The Dred Scott decision is going to alter the way that citizenship is defined for African Americans, who is eligible. The Chief Justice Roger Taney decides that African Americans are not intended to be citizens under the eyes of the Constitution. So let's move on to causes of the Civil War. Intensified by expansion and deepening regional divisions, debates over slavery and other economic, cultural, and political issues led the nation into civil war. So sectionalism and the debates over slavery, there was a difference in the economic systems in the North and the South. So King Cotton in the South, industrialization in the North. Institutions begin to split along northern and southern lines. So we know that the Democratic Party splits between a northern and a southern Democratic Party. There are also other non-political organizations like the Baptist Church splits up into a northern and a southern denomination. Expansion as a cause for the Civil War is also important. So new territories like the Mexican Cession were to be organized into free or slave states, and then also political issues. Compare the Compromise of 1850, which held for about 4 years until the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, and then that brought along more conflict. And then finally Lincoln's election as the catalyst for the secession of South Carolina and then the beginning of the Civil War. So all of these causes you can compare and determine which one is the most important. All right, so responses to slavery. Ideological and economic differences over slavery produced an array of diverging responses from Americans in the North and in the South. So in the South, the Confederacy created a government that was based on the subjugation of African Americans. So in Alexander Stephens' cornerstone speech, he says that the foundation of the Confederate government is that African Americans are inferior to whites. the economic importance of cotton led to this racial ideology because African American enslaved people were the main source of labor. In the North, there begins to be a greater support for abolition through a harsher fugitive slave law. It was the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 that made a lot of Northerners change sides or become more open to abolitionism. And of course, Uncle Tom's Cabin, that was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. The diverse economy in the North led to a greater tendency to oppose slavery because enslaved labor was competing against free labor, and it was also depressing wages that people working for a wage could get. Debates over slavery came to dominate the political discussion in the 1850s, culminating in the bitter election of 1860 and the secession of the southern states. So there's a comparison as to how all the parties treated slavery. Obviously, the Free Soil Party wanted to end slavery, wanted to stop its expansion. When the Republican Party gains more strength, a lot of Free Soilers join the Republican Party. And in their 1860 Republican Party platform, they say that they don't want slavery to continue to be extended. The Democratic Party and the Southern Democratic Party were split on the issue as well. The Southern Democratic Party believed that there should have been greater protections of slavery and that it should be allowed to continue to expand into new territories. The Constitutional Union Party, which was created in the midst of the 1860 election, was trying to chart out a middle way in which slavery would continue to be protected in the states. It would be able to continue to expand under the old compromises, and the North could continue to do whatever it was they're doing through popular sovereignty or allow them to abolish slavery within their state's boundaries. And these political alignments were closely followed by their geography. So in the North, you had more Republicans and very few Republicans in the South. Democrats were all over, but the Southern Democratic Party obviously was based in the South, in the Deep South. And the Constitutional Union Party in the 1860 election, they win a lot of the border states, a lot of the middle states in which people would be split on the issue of slavery. Secession was a more radical response than previous actions by South Carolina whenever it got into an argument with the federal government. So think back to the 1832 nullification crisis, when South Carolina refuses to pay the federal tariff. Back then, they only are threatening to not pay a tariff, to not listen to what the federal government is wanting them to do. And in 1860, they go one step further and they say that the Union has been dissolved because the federal government is going to try and take away slavery, as Abraham Lincoln, or as they saw Abraham Lincoln to be that threat. All right, the Union victory in the Civil War and the contested Reconstruction of the South settled the issues of slavery and secession, but left unresolved many questions about the powers of the federal government and citizenship rights. So you can compare the relative importance and effectiveness of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So obviously they're all really important, but which of these amendments is the most important during Reconstruction? And the answer to that question is not necessarily which of these amendments is the most important today. So obviously the 13th Amendment had huge ramifications by guaranteeing the end of slavery. But probably today, the 14th Amendment is more important because it has been used to extend the Bill of Rights into state laws and protect civil liberties further. Congress went a step further and passed the 1866 and 1875 Civil Rights Bills to try and enforce these new rights of citizenship. They created agencies like the Freedmen's Bureau to aid the transition from enslavement into freedom. But black codes, Jim Crow laws, and violence were ways that the South was using to circumvent those federal policies on equality. All right, now let's compare factors for the Union victory. The North's greater manpower and industrial resources, the leadership of Abraham Lincoln and others, and the decision to emancipate slaves eventually led to the Union military victory over the Confederacy in the devastating Civil War. So when we compare manpower between the North and the South, there was larger urban centers in the North. There was a larger free population of 23 million people versus 5.5 in the South, and 3.5 million people in the South were also enslaved. who could potentially be called upon to help the Union once they were approaching rebel held territory. The industrial resources of the North were also greater. There was more railroad lines in the North. It was important in resupplying the moving troops now that the armies were getting to be in the 20, 30, 40, 50, 60,000 people in just one army. The railroads were important, so the ability to blockade the southern coast was also key because the South could only get more supplies and more money if they could export their cotton. And so it was critical for the North to be able to implement the blockade around the southern coast. And then finally, Lincoln's leadership was really important. He mobilized troops quickly after he became president and took the oath of office in March. And he was able to replace ineffective generals like George McClellan with effective ones like Ulysses S. Grant. Once Grant proved himself to be an able military general in the Western theater of the war. All right, so Reconstruction and the Civil War ended slavery, altered relationships between the states and the federal government, and led to debates over new definitions of citizenship, particularly regarding the rights of African Americans, women, and other minorities. The effectiveness of ending slavery and providing equality. In the 13th Amendment, it abolished slavery, black codes were passed, and Jim Crow laws were passed to try and limit that equality. Sharecropping as the new economic system in the South was keeping a lot of the formerly enslaved people working for their former enslavers, and that undermined equality. There were also differences in powers of the federal and state governments. The federal law superseded the state law according to the Constitution, but there are limits in enforcing the federal policies and enforcing the constitutional amendments because it falls on those southern governments to do so when the Supreme Court in the civil rights cases is diminishing the impact of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments by striking down the Civil Rights Act of 1875. So that law had been passed to try and enforce the amendments, but the Supreme Court decided that it was unconstitutional. All right, and finally, the differences in the new definitions of citizenship. So citizenship is granted to African Americans through the 14th Amendment, but there's a big caveat here since the rights of citizenship are not extended to women and American Indians. They were not mentioned in the 14th Amendment, and so therefore the 15th Amendment will later not apply to them either. In the 1920, women's suffrage is finally going to be passed, so women are going to have to wait another 60 years to be able to vote. In the 1924, Native Americans will finally be recognized as citizens of the United States. All right, and finally a recap. So the historical thinking skill in this topic is comparison, and so I want to make sure that we focus on that for the recap. The comparison of the causes of the Civil War, so you have expansion, sectionalism, politics, the economic systems of the North and the South, but really slavery is the big cause that touches all of the other causes. It's at the center of all of them, at the debate of expansion, the debate over sectionalism, politics, economic systems. Slavery is always at the center of that. The comparison of the factors for the Union victory. So the Union won the Civil War because of greater manpower, greater industrial strength, greater motivation for winning when Abraham Lincoln issued out the Emancipation Proclamation, and better leadership. And finally, the comparison of efforts of Reconstruction, Reconstruction amendments, the Civil Rights Bills, the education expansion for emancipated people, and the Freedmen's Bureau. All of those are important in trying to improve the equality and rights of African Americans, but also the ways in which Southern governments were trying to limit those gains through black codes, the KKK, the Supreme Court decisions of the civil rights cases and the slaughterhouse cases, and also the new economic system of labor, which is sharecropping. All right, that is it for this lecture. Thank you for watching all of period 5. We'll come back in 2021 and start with period number 6. See you then.